Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Global History. I am your host, Langella Sensei. So guys, first off, let's review a little bit of what we talked about last time. We mainly focused on really the origins of the Renaissance. We talked about how Italy was really the birthplace of the Renaissance. This is more about a few days ago when we started section 1. Last episode, we really focused on talking about how there was a revolution in types of writing, right? Because the first day we talked about the change in art and how the Renaissance art was completely different. And last episode, we talked about how writers really had shifted a lot of their focus on being, first off, based in Latin into now being based on what we like to call vernacular, which is actually based on their native language. And a lot of types of writing that we see back in the change in the Renaissance is really based on a really self-expression about really portraying your own individuality, really your own feelings about certain types of subjects, whether it was war, whether it was knowledge, and all these different things that are really focusing on the time period. And we even started to see specific new types of works happening. So we started to see new types of poems, types of writing where we seen examples, specific examples where people were writing almost like short stories about realistic events going on, but it was more of a personalized approach to these subjects that will really show emotion and really tying in the individuality of somebody that's going through a specific major event. We also focused on Machiavelli, and really he was probably one of the biggest figures, especially when it comes to Renaissance writing, because he really creates a political guidebook for the rulers of the time period to try to explain how someone could keep their power when they're really dealing with corrupt and greedy individuals that they are ruling over. And we watched that video that kind of goes over what his work, The Prince, was really about, and explained all the different ideas in which a prince should follow by in order for them to keep their power. And then we finished off with Vittoria Colonna, which she was really a influential writer at the time because she was working with a lot of other major Renaissance men like Michelangelo and Castiglione in helping them develop their work. And she was kind of seen behind the scenes, like she was behind the scenes of as a woman writer. And as I mentioned in the previous episodes, that a lot of times women were told not to seek fame. So that was really part of being a Renaissance woman, and that's really a big difference that we see there. So this time, guys, we're going to focus on section 2. We're going to really talk about how the Renaissance started out in Italy, but then it shifted into really spreading across all of Europe as well. So let's get started. So let me first jump into the slide here. Okay, so we've already talked about some major, really, a lot of Renaissance men that we start out with, like Leonardo da Vinci. We talked about Michelangelo. We talked about Raphael. These were all influential writers of the time, and each one of them was really trying to explain or really shift the belief of the Renaissance type of, when it comes to art, when it comes to writing, into more, a original classical culture of really based on religion concepts and really art that was focused mainly on religion, and then it shifted to a more human approach. Remember the whole humanistic idea of basically trying to express oneself. And really the biggest themes that we see in a lot of Renaissance art was really the idea of human potential. The idea that a human being can exert a lot of different types of skills to really show that they are bigger than what they used to be in the Middle Ages. Remember, the idea where basically during the Middle Ages, people were just insignificant flies in the grand scheme of these kings and these kingdoms. But now we look at the Renaissance, they see as a human being having endless potential, right? They try to expand the ideas where basically individuality is really probably the key facet of being a high-ranking official, or really a respected official. That's where the whole concept of Renaissance man comes from. When we look at Leonardo da Vinci, he was seen as like the universal man, the person that had facets or skills in all different things. And now we saw how important this was when it comes to all facets of life. We started to see even merchants or even the church or even rich individuals, rulers, start to really become patrons, right? They become people that are investing money into these artists, into these universal men, to try to expand their knowledge or to really beautify different parts of the country. And we start to really see this spark by late 1400s, where they start to now spread into different areas, as in England, France, Germany, Flanders. Okay, and we'll jump into that with the rest of this rest of this section. So really, we start to see the spread of the Renaissance due to really conflict, right? When you look at the end of the 100 Years' War, which officially ended in 1453, we can really look at how cities started to expand even more because now there was not really a major conflict going on throughout Europe. Now, there were still battles going on in small spurts. Remember, there's a lot of city-states that are dividing up a lot of different areas. But with the 100 Years' War ending, which is the major conflict, we really start to see a lot of cities growing in population and in wealth because now they are focusing more on trade rather than conflict itself. So with coming of money, we see more people investing in artists. All right. Now, what happens is when you look at northern Italy, based on its contact and its location, we can really point to it being a major trading center for a lot of different things, but mainly, especially when it comes to the clothing industry, right? When we take a look at like Milan, all right, this is where really Milan starts to gain its base in clothing in the clothing industry is during this time period. And because of Italy being divided into all these separate city-states, each area was kind of it's known for its own specific products that they were trading more. But the city-states were becoming major patrons. But England and France that were unified behind monarchs, those monarchs themselves became major patrons of the arts as well. All right. And much like when the Renaissance had started in Italy, all of Europe followed in these ideas, the humanistic ideas, and really they focused on what they call a Judeo-Christian value, which is really the morals of the Bible. Okay, and that's really what you should focus on when you think about Northern Renaissance. Okay, so when we take a look at how it spreads throughout Europe, we really have to take a look at the conflict that was going on in northern Italy. During this time period, there was a battle that was going on in really northern Italy. It was a kind of a conflict that was spreading over. It was basically a French king was trying to take the throne of Naples that was in southern Italy. So he had to launch an attack in northern Italy, and it kind of engulfed the Renaissance. Because remember, guys, it started in northern Italy, and now they're trying to basically scramble. Like a lot of these artists, a lot of these writers had actually fled away from the conflict, and they end up going throughout Europe to try to get away from all the warfare. Because think about it, when there's a French king that is trying to now take control of southern Italy, basically it makes Italy into a battleground, right? And so a lot of people start to flee to get away from Italy itself. So they go into places like England, go into France, they go into Germany, and that's where we start to see a spread of the Renaissance going to different areas. So they brought all the ideas that they had created in the Italian Renaissance now into all different parts of Europe. So let's take a look at first German. All right, so let's take a look at some German painters. One of the first one that we're going to go over is Albrecht Dürer, all right, and he was a really popular artist. He used a lot of his woodcuts and engravings to emphasize the ideas, the humanistic beliefs or the realism aspect, and put it a lot on religious subjects. So the reason why he became extremely popular was because he's mixing now these humanistic ideas with a lot more of religious subjects, which a lot of people still were looking at religion during this time, and his popularity grew because now even the church itself was saying, wow, these are some incredible depictions of religious subjects, and they started using his works to kind of fill their churches. So his popularity started to grow even more. His influence on other people, really because of how much he used religion, started to kind of expand to other German artists as well. And then all of a sudden, like obviously when you have one person that's using humanistic ideas and his work influences somebody else, and that person's now really becoming popular as well, it's almost like a chain, like a web of everyone's now looking at this type of work, the Renaissance style of work, and now they want that for themselves. All right. So when you look at Hans Holbein, he is influenced by Dürer's work, and even English royalty was actually like, he was starting to make portraits of them, and they wanted to buy his portraits. And even when the English royalty or noble families like your work, that means even the common people are going to say, wow, this guy must have some really good stuff, in order for the royalty to really buy into it. So now let's take a look at Flanders. When you take a look at where Flanders is located, it's right above Belgium. So if you take a look at this map, this is where Flanders is, this region here. Okay, so it's right above Belgium, right above France, and next to Germany. So this area is Flanders right over here. So when you take a look at Flanders, a lot of the merchant families within Flanders really were trying to expand the Renaissance style of not only just the arts, but the writing itself. All right, probably one of the most famous painters of this time period was Jan van Eyck, and he actually was one of the first people that started oil-based painting. All right, and now oil-based painting using different layers of paint, he created actually a lot of different shades of color. Now, his work, if you really think of just oil painting, had actually influenced modern day painting, right? And that's where you're using multiple layers of paint. You create different shades of that specific color based on how potent a color might be. If you keep kind of using that same color over it, or even mixing in separate colors to now create shades of one color and another. And he kind of was a pioneer of oil based painting. Okay. His paintings were extremely realistic. They emphasized the humanistic belief. And really, his popularity had reached a peak, and even other people started to kind of copy his works and create their own versions of it. And they like I said, the oil-based painting technique is even used today. So it tells you how important or how popular that did end up becoming. So guys, I want you to answer this question here. What techniques does Bruegel use to give life to his paintings? So this is one of the probably the famous paintings here. So Peter Bruegel was actually used the same oil-based painting techniques, and he actually had made this concept here. And as you could tell, it's pretty detail-oriented and pretty realistic. So when you take a look at the painting itself, you can say that using oil-based techniques, they're mixing in all these different shades and colors to really make a magnificent piece of art. Okay. So now let's move into the humanists and how they really expanded in their writing. Okay. So we already talked about art. Now let's talk about like changing up the writing now in different areas other than Italy. Okay. So one of the big things that happens with a lot of humanists, even back in Italy, was they always challenge a lot of the classical organizations, right? And one of the big ones that really, the big organizations that dominated the time period was obviously the Catholic Church, right? Because Italy is really focusing on the Catholic Church, especially with really the head of the Roman Catholic Church being in Italy itself. Okay, so they actually challenge the Catholic Church and really start to go against a lot of the traditional values. So, if, for instance, what they wanted to do was revolutionize or just reform society itself, and what they wanted to do was really promote education more than they've ever have before. Especially when it came to women, because women were probably less educated, because a lot of people usually focus on males getting all of the reading skills back at this time period. So this was a really big shift in what society was looking at, and they wanted to try to have more schools, to have more common people be educated than ever. Because back then it was mainly just the nobles or the rich families would be educated, but that's now starting to shift. So probably one of the most popular Christian humanists was probably Desiderius Aramis, all right, was of Holland, and Thomas More were probably the two most popular. Now, Aramis had created a book called The Praise of Folly, and this one actually went after basically people that were tied to Christianity, as in, like, not saying that Christianity was bad, but basically saying the people that had only depended on the priest to give them the word of God, he poked fun at them, and even poked fun at the rich nobles of the time period, because they're saying that, not one of their rules that they put in place should be the final say, as in the people should really have more say when it comes to politics and even religion. So, for instance, what he wanted to do to improve society was to have people themselves study the Bible, right? And that's a really important concept that's going to really come out at you when we talk about the Reformation. All right, so make sure you understand that this is starting to be an idea that more people are having, because For the longest time before the Renaissance, people were looking to the religious leaders to tell them everything they would need to know about religion, right? Because the reality is not a lot of people were educated enough that they could read the Bible. So the fact that now more people started to be educated, more people started to have the ability to read, it made it even more so that they said, listen, we shouldn't just believe everything that the Christian rulers tell us to do, or the Christian higher-ups tell us to do. We should be able to make our own opinions. And that's probably the biggest thing that is said in Aramis's book, The Praise of Folly, okay? Thomas More, on the other hand, he is from England. He creates a model society in his book called Utopia, all right? Now, the Utopia is almost like a pipe dream. It's a created story about where a land where greed, corruption, and war have been basically destroyed. There's no such thing as any of these three things. And he's trying to use this idea to try to teach how if we get rid of really the greed, then there won't be any problems, right? Because when you look at greed encompasses both corruption and war, because he's trying to say in his book that if you are greedy, you're trying to gain a upper hand on somebody else. You're going to resort to corruption to get your way. And then war is usually used to expand land. So they're trying to say that the greed of rulers causes wars, which makes people die. So when you take a look at, this is an excerpt from his book, Utopia, I'll read it for you. Gold and silver, of which money is made, are so treated that no one values them more highly than their true nature deserves. Who does not see that they are far inferior to iron in usefulness, since without iron mortals cannot live any more than without fire and water? Okay? So now we see how people are challenging the norms of society, and one of the big things that is challenged is even the treatment of women and really women's roles of this society. Because like I said before, and even in the other episodes, was that women weren't treated nearly as equal, and even when it came to education, women were not educated. And one of the big things that we see is that with these new Christian humanists, they actually start to kind of want to push for education for all, for both males and females, because they felt that more educated society means a more stable, more safe society. Now, most of the time, it was boys that were sent to be educated, and usually it was those that were higher class citizens were the only ones that were sent. But probably the most famous woman that went against these Christian norms of the time was Christine de Pizan, right? And what she did was she was probably the most famous for being a writer, but she was probably a symbolistic of being a Renaissance woman. But the only difference was that she wasn't going to stay in the shadows. She was going to be out in the open, and she was up in your face about making sure that women had also the right to be educated as well. And what she wrote so many different types of books. She wrote short stories, biographies, novels, and even military technique manuals. And she wanted to push the idea that women should also be educated as well. And here's a primary source analysis. If I want you guys to do, I'll read it for you. I'm amazed by the opinion of some men who claim that they do not want their daughters, wives, or kinswomen to be educated because their mores or morals would be ruined as a result. Here you can clearly see that not all opinions of men are based on reason, and that these men are wrong. And this is kind of a straight up just saying the fact that you're claiming that if you want your sisters, your wives, your kinswomen to not be educated because it goes against your morals is such a dumb concept that you are just wrong if you think this way, right? And she kind of basically just comes right at your face and says you're wrong, because deep down there's no excuse why women should not be educated here. Now, what's important, I make sure I highlight this for you guys down here, is she's really one of the first European writers to question the treatment of men and women, all right? And her goal really was to get education for both sexes. And unfortunately for her, this doesn't really happen until really centuries later on. But she was really, if you're trying to compare to progressive views that we started to see, in it actually starts happening in the 1800s. We see a lot of a push for education for women. But just the fact that this is happening back then during the Renaissance, right? The Renaissance does spark a lot of these ideas that happened during progressive era. So just to kind of jump on this same idea of Renaissance, both women and men now expanding the idealisms. Let's take a look at England during the mid 1500s. This is known as the Elizabethan age under Queen Elizabeth I, and probably one of the most famous rulers of England. She reigns from 1558 to 1603. Now, she would be considered a Renaissance woman. All right, she is fluent French, Italian, Latin, and Greek, and she supported. She was a patron of all the arts and literature within England. She was really trying to push the boundaries on what England can learn in a certain time, okay? And one of the big things she pushes is the use of the arts. And William Shakespeare was one of the people that she had supported the most during her time, okay? Now, William Shakespeare, we all know, is probably regarded as the greatest playwright to ever live. His plays have been, redone. They've been read. We do them in Kennedy Catholic. His plays are famous and they're classics. All right. And now he really looks to Greek and Roman plays or to really get a lot of his to get a lot of his inspiration from, okay? And that's what's really important to know about where he gets a lot of his support from, is because he follows in the Renaissance belief of using the classics, right, to help shape his character. Now, throughout all of his plays, they're always focusing on really character development, all right? And from really the tragic story of how a character can change from being one way to changing to another, and really trying to put a humanistic approach to it. Now, if you ever read any of his plays, you can always see that there are a tragic story behind them, or as in, like probably most famously Romeo and Juliet, right? We've all know general story about it, but it shows you really the tragedy of something. Not saying that this could ever happen in modern era, but you can understand the tragedy that's happening here, right? The fact that there was warring families and there's love between between a member of each of those families, and it's really a conflict that's happening, right? And you can really understand, and that's why his plays are so moving, is because he depicts conflict going on and character development and really making a tough decision to do one thing or another. And that's why his plays become so famous. Now, the reason why he was considered a Renaissance man is because a lot of these plays really focus on the individuality and expression of really achievement of anybody, okay? So I want you guys to answer this question on the side here. What are 2 ways in which Shakespeare's work showed Renaissance influences? So you take a look at Shakespeare's popularity. These are all examples here of a lot of his plays that have been reworked into modern era movies, okay? But there's countless connections to a lot of his playwrights. Oh, I think I'm going too far here. Okay? So make sure you understand that. So now let's take a look at how the printing press really changes everything when it comes to Renaissance ideas. So we've already talked about how movable type was actually created in China, right? We did talk about this last time we mentioned China. I forgot which chapter it was in, but remember, movable type, guys, was basically they would have a piece that would depict the specific symbol that they're using when in China, and they would align them on for the piece of paper to be stamped on, so that it would be a lot quicker for them to print new material. Now, understand, in the Chinese writing system, there are thousands of different characters. So even though this might have helped the development of writing, writing pieces in China, it was still not the most practical way of doing things because there's so many different characters. But however, when you look at European writing systems, they have a lot less characters that they have to deal with. So for them, it became actually an extremely efficient system. So what they do create is the printing press. All right, the printing press is basically a copy mirror of the movable type, but they have it more of a very similar concept where they have the different characters and they would print basically all the characters down to make it as quickly as possible. All right. And they would make, like let's just say when you're making books, right? Books back before the printing press would take like literally weeks or months to create a book. Mainly weeks, but it would take weeks to make a book because you have to bind each page by page. Okay. But printing presses allowed them to create books in such quicker time, like multiple books in weeks. All right. So the person that you should know is John Gutenberg. Creates the printing press in Germany in 1440. And this is really important because with the printing press being developed, it was now a lot cheaper and easier to now have access to books, right? Understand, as I mentioned before, it would take months to bind a book page by page. But for each book, obviously the amount of hours that's being taken to make that book, it's going to cost a lot of money because they do it based on how much time and effort they put into doing that. But now, since they have the printing press, it's actually a lot quicker for them to make the book, which means it's cheaper. Which means that now more people have access to books. When more people have access to books, which means that more people can read, which means more people are educated, okay? And that is a chain reaction of things that will cause more things, especially in sections 3 and 4 when you talk about the Reformation, all right? But the first book that was made was actually the Bible, right? And it's called the Gutenberg Bible, which is 1455, all right? And the fact that it's the Bible kind of gives you a hint on what's the first thing that more people are going to have their opinion on, because now they have access to it, the Bible, right? And we'll talk more about that in section 3. But the reason, like I said, the reason why the printing press is important, guys, and I kind of focus it on here, it makes things cheaper, which means that more people have ability to buy things. They have, and they now can read more, okay? And it started with religious books, but then it changes to medical guides, travel guides, and even more individualistic books that reflect the Renaissance ideas, okay? So here's the printing press. I'm not going to go too in depth on this here. This is on your PowerPoint worksheet, but just the fact that it'll take like 5 months to make one book in the previous way where a person would sit down and handwrite the books, handwrite each page itself would take so long. And now with the printing press, you can tell that you can make 500 books in 5 months versus just one book in 5 months, right? And we go into all the different mechanisms that make up the printing press. And this is on your PowerPoint and also on the PowerPoint worksheet. So let's take a look now at the legacy of the Renaissance. Okay, I have a few slides left, and then I have a little quick video here, and we'll go into it. But let's just focus on the legacy here. So remember, guys, the European Renaissance had a major effect on really when it comes to artistic means, when it comes to writing, freedom of expression, and really jumpstarts a social change as well. All right. From basically being a medieval period that focused on a lot about religious ideas and really staying in your lane and not really having expression or having a thought about one specific thing, we can see that the Renaissance really changed that completely, right? People now started to have their own ideas when it comes to certain things, especially when it comes to government, when it comes to religion. We started to see a big change in these ideas, right? Having this humanistic approach, and even being, being your own person, right? Living in the moment, a new way of living in general. And then on top of that, with the printing press makes things even more accessible. Okay. And a lot of historians really point to the Renaissance having a bigger effect, like the printing press having bigger effect on life than even the use of personal computers. So when we look at art, guys, I put a bunch of different art pieces here that were made during the Renaissance. These are all famous pieces of art, but you can tell that when you look at medieval art and then you look at Renaissance style art, they really portrayed like expression, right? Individual expression. They look at how detail oriented each of these pieces are, right? And it talks about, and now a lot of them are associated with religious beliefs, of course, but there are also those that were not. When it comes to just art itself, you can say that these are more realistic looking, right? And they focus on the human expression. When it comes to written works, they were secular in purpose. They were now based on specific areas when it comes to vernacular, and they're more personal pieces, right? They're not just writing about like a, I don't know, like a firsthand account of something. Not like a event, like a historical event or anything. It's like personal beliefs. So people started to have their own ideas about what is going on at this time period. And then we look at the changes in society in general. Now, I highlighted specific things that you should know. But first off, I think having probably one of the most important ones in my eyes is having the more availability of books in, just for more people to read is probably the biggest impact here, because now it makes people say, I want to read, I want to learn more things. And remember, the whole idea of the Renaissance man is to have skill sets in all different facets. Okay. And that's, I think, the biggest thing. The availability of having books causes a lot of, really jumpstarts a lot of things. I think when you look at now, printing press allows people to have more different types of written documents when it comes to maps, charts. It creates more, in-depth analysis of all different things. And I think with the availability of having more maps, it makes people want to discover more. And this leads to discoveries in the new world, because with now more maps, more ideas about, I want to experience more things, the discovery of the new world jumpstarts because of the Renaissance. Okay, when you look at legal proceedings, people start to now have understand more about the laws and what makes up the laws and why laws are the way they are. And then lastly, I think when you want to take a look at Christian humanists, it really focuses on people trying to gain a better understanding of education. They want to make more people learn more, right? And that's where we start to see more colleges, more schools be developed. All right. And we're going to jump into how, when more people are educated, they start to now question the standard beliefs in religion itself. And we're going to jump that into section.
Hello, historians. This is Mr. Fredo. It's time for us to wind down our Renaissance unit with our last quick mini lesson, and that's where we get to focus on the impact. A 300-year time period, 1300 to 1600 CE, and what difference did it make? This is a 300-year time period that changes the world in more ways than any of us could probably count. So it's important for us to look back. What's the legacy of this time period going to be? Because it's lasting. That's what a legacy is. It stands the test of time, the difference that was made during this 300-year block. It isn't like a fad. It's not like silly bands or tennis shoes that have wheels on the back of them. This is something that's going to really stand the test of time. And so in order to start understanding the impact of the Renaissance, I think the first thing we need to examine again is this philosophy of humanism that really starts to become popular at the very beginning of this time period. Humanism, at the forefront of the Renaissance, put the emphasis on the person, that their potential was limitless, that they didn't have to depend on a pope or a priest or a king to tell them what's right and what's wrong, that they could think about it themselves. And I think that's really where this all begins. As soon as people start thinking for themselves, that's where we see these great changes start to be made. Now, another step in understanding the impact of the Renaissance is looking at overall how much the Renaissance and what happened during that time period raised the bar. What used to be considered the standard of excellence for ancient Greece maybe was down here. And then the Romans took their ideas and made them a little bit better. And then throughout the Middle Ages, maybe there was a little bit of an increase. I don't know. There wasn't a whole lot of development during the Middle Ages. But what the Renaissance does is it takes the standard of expectations and it puts them through the roof throughout the rest of history. Whether it has to do with the quality of artwork or whether it has to do with the amount of knowledge a person possesses, you name it, the Renaissance and what happened during that time period forever raises the bar in the standard of quality and what people expect when they think of excellence. Now, all of these actions and associations that we have with the Renaissance also leads to the Age of Exploration. That's during that same 300-year time period, and this will be our last unit of the year. I'm looking forward to this one as well. But it's the science and it's the belief that anything is possible. during the Renaissance that leads to people actually having this crazy enough idea that they can leave Europe and travel all the way across the Atlantic Ocean and find new places to live and find new places to claim. That would have never happened if it wasn't for the Renaissance and this belief that anything was possible. Same for the Reformation, also happens during this within this time period. The idea of people actually challenging the Catholic Church, no way. People would have never thought about that if they didn't think that anything was possible. Again, that's the big focus of the Renaissance's legacy. And then lastly, kind of a renewed emphasis on science, that it's not just about religion or religious teachings, that science can be used to explain the ways of the universe, and that's going to lead into the scientific revolution, which I believe you guys will talk about a lot more your freshman year in your 9th grade history class.
3. All right, guys, I want you guys to answer these questions here. These are in your PowerPoint worksheet, and then answer the main ideas on this page. All right, next time we're going to talk about the Reformation and Martin Luther.